We've all been sold a massive lie about how free trade actually works. You know the story, right? Open up your borders, let the global competition in, and boom, local companies suddenly get scared, they innovate, and they magically get better. Well, the data says otherwise. Today, we're diving into an explainer on India's legendary 1991 economic miracle. And let me tell you, the truth behind these numbers, it is absolutely brutal. So think about it. Does ripping open a market actually force lazy companies to innovate? We just assume they get smarter, right? We assume they figure it out and thrive out of sheer panic. It's that classic survival of the fittest fairy tale we all learned in Econ 101.
But the hard data completely shatters that intuition. The answer is a massive, resounding no. Opening a market doesn't magically turn some sluggish company into an absolute innovator. No, it just kills the weak. Period. Which brings us to part one, the free market illusion. To really get this, we have to jump right into part two, India's 1991 crisis. Picture this, it's 1991, and things are looking totally catastrophic. Remittances are plunging, oil prices are spiking off the charts, the country is practically running out of cash. So what happens? The IMF steps in with an emergency bailout. But there's a huge catch. To get the money, India is forced to essentially rewrite its entire economic playbook practically overnight. I mean, just look at this staggering number right here, 95%. Before 1991, India hid its industries behind a 95% average tariff on manufactured goods. Imagine that. No foreign rivals, no real pressure. And then, without warning, that massive protective shield was just violently ripped away. And that leads us to part three, learning versus stealing. Okay, so when those massive tariff walls fell, the country's overall productivity actually shot up by nearly 20%. But how? Economists basically split this into two camps, learning versus stealing. Learning is the fairy tale version. Existing companies just magically figure out how to do more with less. Stealing, though, that's pure corporate Darwinism. That's the big fish eating the small fish, where ultra-efficient firms simply crush their weak rivals and devour their market share. Now, check out the data we have mapped out here. I want you to specifically notice that red dashed line at the bottom. That tracks this exact stealing effect over time. And look at what happens the exact second we cross that 1991 vertical line. It just shoots straight up. Let's break this timeline down, because it's fascinating. Before the crisis, you had the slow, sluggish growth driven by learning. But right after 1991, boom, a violent stealing shock. Economic growth wasn't coming from companies suddenly fixing their bad habits. Nope, it was a vicious reallocation of power. The giants were literally feasting on the inefficient. Sure, by the late 90s, things stabilized back into a learning phase, but that initial explosion, pure predatory stealing. So let's move to part four, the input secret. This right here is the true game changer. Exposing local Indian companies to foreign competition, it barely moved the needle. We're talking a tiny 3.2% boost. Fear of competition didn't drive the innovation. But slashing the taxes on the raw materials they needed, now that changed the entire game. Look at that jump. Giving these companies cheaper access to imported parts and materials drove an absolute massive 21.8% surge in aggregate productivity. So the real hero wasn't the threat of cheaper foreign competition, it was finally getting their hands on cheaper building blocks. Think about it. You can't bake a better cake just by screaming at the baker to work harder, right? You have to give them cheaper, better flour and sugar. Which brings us to the harshest lesson in part five, the brutal reality. To figure this out, researchers did something totally unprecedented. They built a massive database tracking these firms over decades. They paired up the data, bridged the missing gaps, and meticulously tracked the exact same surviving factories for 20 straight years. Why? To see if these ultimate survivors actually truly learned anything at all. And honestly, the results are mind-blowing. Look at how tiny that true within-firm improvement segment actually is. Out of the 5.4% average productivity bump we saw from those input tariffs, the actual internal improvement from existing companies was radically small, only 1.7%. The vast majority of the gain came strictly from churn, old, tired firms dropping dead, and new, hungry firms launching to take their place. Your big takeaway here is just staggering. The learning phase, it was mostly an illusion. It was really just a massive wave of the free market burying the inefficient and crowning entirely new winners. The older companies didn't really get better at their jobs. The bad ones just died out.
It was essentially corporate elimination, cleverly disguised as self-improvement.
Finally, let's wrap up with part 6, flaws and contributions.
Now, while this methodology of tracking firms over decades is completely groundbreaking, it does have one massive blind spot. Yes, it definitively separates learning from stealing, which is huge, but it only measures that stealing within the exact same industry. Big steel companies eating small steel companies. It completely misses the massive wealth transfers that were simultaneously happening between totally different industries across the broader economy. So this whole explainer leaves us with a really provocative question. Is the promise of a free market really about inspiring innovation? Or is it just the brutal reality of survival of the fittest? The next time someone preaches to you about the absolute magic of global free trade, don't just nod along. Look at the numbers and ask yourself, who is actually learning out there and who is just getting eaten?